Post-impressionism is the name that has been given to artists who were influenced by the Impressionists, but who developed their own unique styles. And these are a group of artists working at the late 19th century, but it doesn't refer to a particular style. And the name is a little misleading. Post-impressionism sounds like they came after the Impressionist, but they lived at the same time as the Impressionist. Some of the Impressionists lived longer than some of the Post-impressionists. And at least one of them, Cezanne, worked with the Impressionists. Now, we have a list of artists who are sometimes grouped under Post-impressionism. The first name on the list, Auguste Rodin, really doesn't fit with the others. When someone's writing a textbook, they sometimes have artists who don't fit neatly into the categories, but they have to put them somewhere. So in some textbooks, you'll find Rodin under the Impressionists. In some textbooks, you'll find him under the Post-impressionists. But he actually didn't work with either one. He was a sculptor, and let's take a look at some of his work. This is Rodin's monument of the Burghers of Calais. Now, when you compare that to the picture in your text, you may notice that the color is somewhat different. This statue was part of an exhibition that was given at the National Gallery of Art in Washington in the mid-1980s. And it looks brand new. The reason is because they still have the casts from Rodin's sculpture. And there's a Rodin Foundation, and they will make new casts of some of his work so that more than one museum will have the same work of art. Now, this statue was cast for the exhibit in the mid-1980s, but it looks like the statue might have looked in 1886. Where you will find it now is in the Hirshhorn Sculpture Garden, right across from the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. And if you look at the picture that's in your text, you'll notice that the color is now kind of a gray-green. And that's because it's oxidized. Bronze is an alloy of tin and copper. And when it's been exposed to the elements, bronze starts to take on a greenish cast. So this statue was photographed by my brother-in-law at the exhibition. And so you're seeing it sort of newly cast. But now, of course, it has a green patina to it. Let me talk a little bit more about Rodin. He was a sculptor who worked in marble, bronze, and alabaster. His subject was the expressive human form, human figure, and sometimes parts of the human figure. For example, he has a sculpture that's just hands that's called Cathedral. He was influenced both by the unfinished statues of Michelangelo and by classical statues that often come down to us in fragments. So think about, if you know the work, the Winged Victory of Samothrace, who has today no head or no arms because they've been broken off and destroyed over the centuries. Rodin would sometimes do that deliberately, not breaking off the arms, but just not including parts of the body. So he might have fragmentary figures. Also, we saw an example of an unfinished statue by Michelangelo. And you may remember it looked like the figure was struggling against the block, like it was trying to get out. Well, Rodin would do that deliberately. He would have a figure emerging from the stony quality of the block. So just to show you something in the other media, Here is Rodin's Kiss in marble, and his Orpheus and Eurydice in alabaster. One of the things I sometimes think of is, well, with Rodin, you can find some kind of relationship between all of the primary art movements of the 19th century. Like the neoclassicists, he sometimes uses classical subject matter. You see here Orpheus and Eurydice, and the human form is the most important thing. Like the Romantics, he shows great emotion in his work. Like the realists, well, when he exhibited one of his earlier works, it's called The Age of Bronze, and it's a figure. Originally, he couldn't even afford to have it cast in bronze. It has been cast since. But people accused him of casting from the actual model rather than creating the sculpture himself. And he had to bring the model and had to say, no, he made this work all on his own. So that was so realistic. And you'll see that with the Burghers of Calais. And then, what Impressionism? He's sometimes put under the category of Impressionist because some of his bronze statues seem to have facets. In other words, the plaster model from which the bronze was cast would not be all smoothed over. It would still have the impressions of the tools and the fingers where the work was done, and that gives it a kind of irregular surface that might catch the light. And so some people would compare it with Impressionism. But of course, Rodin was not interested in dissolving the form. He wasn't trying to show you light and atmosphere. He's showing you the emotional qualities of a human figure. And then Post-impressionism. Well, he's living at the right time, isn't he? So let's look at the Burghers of Calais. Now, first thing I should tell you is the word burgher means a citizen of a town. A burg is a town. And Calais was an English city on what is today French soils. It actually was the last city in France that the English retained. It was lost to the English in the 16th century. I read one book where it said it was under the reign of Henry VIII, and another book that said that Calais was lost during the reign of Mary I. But at any rate, the Tudors were the last to have and then lose this city for the English. This was a commissioned monument, and it was a monument to an event that occurred during the 100 Years' War. Now, the 100 Years' War actually went on longer than 100 years. It was throughout the 14th century and pretty well into the 15th century. Some of you have read Shakespeare's play Henry V, so you know that for a certain period during the 100 Years' War, the English were winning. And the war was over who should be the king of the territory that we now consider to be France. Well, of course, the French king thought he should be the ruler. The English king had a pretty good claim to the throne. And so they warred over this for literally over 100 years. Now, as I said, the English seem to be, what can I say, doing well with the war. People made their fortunes. And then, near the end of the war, things changed. You've heard about Joan of Arc. That was one thing. This peasant girl gives the French army new heart. And then the other thing that happened was that the Duke of Burgundy changed sides. Now, this was Philip the Good, Jan van Eyck's patron, and the Burgundians had sided with the English throughout much of the war, but then in the 15th century, they changed sides, and that also led to the eventual defeat of the English. This is a monument about an event that occurred in the 14th century. And Calais was besieged by the English king, Edward, and they were being starved out. They had to give way. And I've heard various versions of this story, so I'm going to tell you one. Your book has it slightly different. The people who are shown here as the burghers of Calais, these were the richest men in town. They would be, the city council. They would be rich merchants and bankers. But at the defeat of Calais, the usual thing that would happen would be that the city would be pillaged. And so the leading citizens come out in sackcloth and ashes with hempen ropes around their neck to be hung, quartered, and drawn. Because they, as wealthy as they were not aristocrats. And they would be given the death for treason for a commoner. And they asked the king that he vent his rage on them and spare their city. Now, the version I heard was that the queen heard about this and intervened. And the burghers were pardoned, and so was the city. I may have heard a romantic version of it, but that's the story I heard. So this is a monument to the citizens who were willing to sacrifice themselves in the hope that their city could be spared. Okay, so Rodin creates this monument, and the patrons are displeased. This is not what they expected. They expected to have ideal figures in heroic poses, maybe, some type of triangular composition, maybe up on a pedestal, maybe, just, showing what great heroes they are. And what do you get? You get extremely realistic figures, not idealized. And they seem to be sort of milling around. The composition seems really almost random. And notice that this is just a little slab underneath the figures. They're not up on a high pedestal. They seem to be, you could put it on the ground and people could go right up to it and interact with it. What kind of monument to heroes is that? Now, that kind of reaction reminds me of what happened with an American monument to a war. Maya Ying Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial. When her design was first shown, there were many people who were just outraged. It didn't have figures. It was by a young woman. They just didn't like it. There's a lot of outcry, just as there was with Rodin's Burghers of Calais. And just as it was with Rodin's Burghers of Calais, both Rodin's monument and Lin's monument are now considered to be, beloved by the people. I think what happens is when people have certain expectations about art, and someone does something that's different than those expectations, there's a shock, and there's, a reaction. And sometimes it takes people a while to get used to new ideas, new concepts, a new visualization. And of course, the Burghers of Calais is now regarded as a wonderful monument. that strongly shows you the emotions of these people. Here is this man, in a pose of desperation. And you'll see all of these different emotions on the faces of the figures. I'm just going to show you a few details. Despair, fear, stoic resignation. Very human. Not just, I'm a hero, but what people might actually be feeling under those circumstances. Here, this is the one I said, stoic resignation. But also, I think you can see that the surface is not polished over and very, very smooth the way a neoclassical statue might be. These would be worked in, there'd be an armature and plaster over that, and the full-scale model would be created, and then it would be cast. They'd make a mold from the plaster statue, and then cast in bronze from the mold. So what you're seeing there is this sort of irregular surface, and it's got the artist's touch, it's got the touch of some of his tools, and light can reflect off of these facets, and that's what makes some people think of Impressionism. But of course, it's very, very different because the light does not dissolve the form. The form is paramount with Rodin. Here's another detail, which I think just has these amazing, positive and negative spaces and understanding of anatomy. And here is this figure that we saw before, the entire figure. Now let's look at an artist who is considered to be a post-impressionist. He actually worked with the Impressionists. And so I want to tell you a little bit about Paul Cézanne. And here you see one of his self-portraits. When Paul Cézanne was a young man, he had a very good friend he grew up with, whose name was Émile Zola. And when they were growing up, Zola said, I'm going to grow up and be a great writer. And Cézanne said, I'm going to grow up and be a great artist. And lo and behold, they both did. Unfortunately for their friendship, Zola got his fame first. He is a famous French realist novelist. And he wrote a novelette about a failed artist who goes mad. Cézanne thought he was writing about him. And, Zola really didn't understand Cézanne's art. And this novelette broke the friendship. Now, Cézanne was from an upper middle class family. His father was a banker, and his father totally opposed him being an artist. He thought his son should be something respectable, like a banker or a lawyer. But Cézanne persevered. And I know of no one who, just by the dint of hard work, made himself into a great artist, because we're going to show you one of his early works and where he came from, essentially, in his art, and then where he went to. And it's very interesting. Now, he never had to work for a living. Even though his father opposed what he was doing, his father did give him an allowance. It wasn't lavish, but it was something he could live on if he lived frugally. And then when his father did die, Cézanne had the inheritance. So we're going to look at an early picture first. In survey books, people do not usually show these very, very early paintings of Paul Cézanne from the 1860s. His early paintings are dark. They're frequently seem emotional. They're imaginary. And sometimes they even have violent themes. This one is a murder. Not always, but there are some like that. but they're imaginary. Sometimes they're called his dark paintings, his romantic paintings, his Baroque paintings, something that suggests strong emotional quality. So he's painting these dark paintings, and then he meets the Impressionists. And his whole life changes. The Impressionists are his friends. Pissarro, who was one of the older Impressionists, became his mentor. And Pissarro would dress in a suit, and he had a beard, and he looked like God the Father, essentially. And he took the young Cezanne under his wing. And he really was a kind of surrogate father as well as a mentor to him. It was like a father who approves of his art rather than says, oh, this is a great disaster. So he's working side by side with the Impressionists. He knows them. He goes to their houses. And what did he learn from the Impressionists? He learned to lighten his palette, get rid of all those dark, dreary colors, and to work in nature. And working in nature, he acquired a discipline, and he learned to observe. Later on in his life, the art dealer Villard was watching him paint, and he said that Cezanne would look at the landscape for 20 minutes and then put down a stroke of paint. So Cezanne is working side by side with the Impressionists, and he exhibits with them in the Impressionist exhibits. The painting I'm showing you here, you can see that he's lightened his palette. He's actually looked at the landscape, which in this case is, a house in the country. But there's one connection with his earlier work, and that's the title. This is called The House of the Hanged Man, and it's a house in which a person committed suicide. This painting was shown at the first Impressionist exhibit, the one they called the Society of the Anonymous Artists, in 1874. So Cezanne worked with and exhibited with the Impressionists. But his artistic aims differed from the Impressionists, and that's why he's called a Post-impressionist. Now, when people are talking about Cezanne, they have a lot of quotations to choose from. But this is the one that I think helps sum up what he's trying to do with his art. Cezanne says, I want to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of the museums. Now, remember, at this time, Impressionist art was new and radical. It was not in the art museums. So he's thinking of the art museums as, the great art that is timeless. And he also uses those words solid and durable. Now, wait a minute. He wants to make of Impressionism solid and durable? Well, that's a paradox. Impressionism refers to the transitory moment, but Cezanne says he's trying to create permanence. Durable. And Impressionist art has the light dissolving the form of the object or the motif. But Cezanne uses light or color, but Cezanne uses color and shape to suggest solidity. So it's almost like the opposite of the Impressionists. He's using their tools, their vocabulary, if you will, but he does something very different with it. So let's see, how does he do that? Well, it's often said that Cezanne paints with colored planes. And if you look at, and this of course is a detail, and we'll look at some other works by him, but you can see in one way the brushstrokes form a kind of plane that's parallel to the picture surface. Also, you have these geometric forms that lead you back with planar recession into the distance. He also creates compositions that are based on geometric forms. They're sometimes called architectonic forms. And he seems to be wanting to create some kind of harmony, balance. In other words, these are all things that we've talked about with Renaissance art, and yet, his art looks so very different than Renaissance art. It's been suggested that Cezanne's paintings suggest that there is an underlying order and structure in nature, not just that ephemeral moment of the Impressionists. So I'm going to show you two landscapes of the same motif by Cezanne. They were done almost 2 decades apart. I said Monet painted many series paintings, and so did Cezanne. One of the series that he painted was Mont Sainte-Victoire. He went down to the south of France and lived there for the rest of his life. And in this area, there was a mountain, Sainte-Victoire. And he painted that landscape with that mountain over and over and over. So here you see a picture of Mont Sainte-Victoire from 1886. This is in the Courtauld Museum in London. And you can see some of the things we've talked about. Now, this picture is a little bit different than his other paintings of Mont Sainte-Victoire because it has this repoussoir device, which is what we call it when you have an object that is close to the picture plane, and then you look beyond that and you see the distant landscape or figures going on beyond it. And of course, he uses that tree as a kind of repoussoir device. This is really close up, so we see this effect of distant space, but also as a kind of frame. And you'll notice how the pine branches seem to fill the sky and repeat the shape of the mountain. Well, if you look at the landscape, you'll notice all of these somewhat geometric forms as though they are planes. And just like with a Raphael or a Poussin, you seem to be able to go back the layer by layer, the bushes, the buildings, the fields, more bushes, all parallel to the picture plane. You can see this aqueduct, parallel to the picture plane, going back, and of course with the mountain rising up on the horizon. And here is the same mountain. He's painting this in the early 20th century. And this particular version of Mont Sainte-Victoire is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I think you can see clearly here that as he lays down his brush strokes, they call that the fracture, but as he lays down the brush strokes, they each form a kind of plane. And you're building up the surface. And when you look at this, you can see both this idea that the mountain is far back in the distance and, our eyes are going through the buildings and the trees to reach it. But you can also see the flatness of the canvas. You can look at it as though it's two-dimensional, and you can look at it as though we're three-dimensional. So he's creating this harmony between the surface and depth. You could also see the architectonic form of the mountain. And when you look at his different paintings of the mountains, sometimes the mountains seem to have different shapes to it. Sometimes that particular curve form gets emphasized more than in other views. Is it just because it's a slightly different point of view, or is he emphasizing different things and making changes to the landscape? He's not just trying to report what do I see in a landscape. He's creating this world. There you see a close-up. And here you see two of the many versions of Mont Sainte-Victoire. What is he doing? He often mentions that he's seeking a realization and doesn't clearly define what does that mean. But this is what it seems to me, that he's taking things that are generally considered to be opposites, things like foreground and background, surface and depth, geometry and organic forms, and trying to create a harmony between them. Or, as I put it in an article one time, he's trying to reconcile the dichotomies. Okay, that's big fancy words for he's trying to make opposites harmonious. It's a paradox. How can you do that? And yet he does. Now, something else he does that's quite interesting is he shows us a new way of vision in art. I've seen books that call this something like multifocal perspective, but I just call it the moving eye. He shows us distortions that essentially are based on the way we look at things, on how human beings actually look, on how human beings actually see. Now, ever since the Renaissance, Brunelleschi invented one-point linear perspective. And we've used that to show depth on a surface. And we accept the convention. But when you start to think about it, human beings really don't see that way. When we're looking out over a room or a landscape or anything, our eyes don't focus on a single vanishing point or on any single point and then let our peripheral vision pick up everything else. Our eyes move. We look from one thing to another. We may move our head, but certainly our eyes move. And we focus on many points, as shown in Cézanne's art. Now we're going to look at one last painting by Cezanne. This is actually a painting he was working on probably right up until very close to his death. I've seen it dated anywhere from 1900 to 1905. He may have worked on it for a number of years. As you can imagine, this is not painted from the landscape. This has a painting that has been created in his studio and it was concocted. Over his lifetime, Cezanne painted bathers over and over and over again. There's one very early one from the 1860s, and then, of course, the 70s, the 80s, throughout the 19th century, right up until, as you can see here, just before his death in 1906. And you can see this is called the large bathers, or the grand baigneuses, which the grand means either large size or great. There's three of Cezanne's paintings that are called the grand baigneuses, the large or the great bathers, because they're larger than his other paintings of bathers. Two of them are in the Philadelphia area. This one is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. There's another one in the Barnes Foundation in Marion Station, right outside of Philadelphia. And then there's a third one in London in the National Gallery. But there are many paintings by Cezanne of bathers, both females, as you see here, and also male bathers. For example, there's one, I think, was exhibited in the 1877 Impressionist exhibit of male bathers that is in the Barnes Foundation, once again, Marion Station. So this is a subject he painted over and over. It is a traditional subject. During, for example, the 18th century, people painted bathers. Essentially, they're people skinny dipping, if you will, in a river or in a pool, and it gives the artist a chance to paint nude figures, but not necessarily with the classical names on it. They probably come out of Renaissance pictures of the bath of Diana or nymphs bathing, sort of a classical subject, and then just take on a kind of secular view. Now, Cezanne did not arrange nude models in nature. The figures actually come out of artwork, and in some cases, particularly the male bathers, we know there are some photographs that he used. And as you can see, these figures are simplified, they're stylized, but sometimes we can sort of trace their origins in art, and I'll show you an example in a minute. When he lived in Paris, he went to the Louvre and he drew from the famous paintings and statues of past times. He did drawings from Poussin, from Rubens, from classical sculpture, from Baroque sculpture. And these were collected in notebooks, which still exist today. When he's painting his bathers, he often uses figures with the same or similar poses. And we sometimes even give them names. There's the figure here you can see on the far left that we call the Strider, and several figures that are kneeling, they're crouching. I'll show you the source of those in a moment. So, for example, we have some of these crouching figures, and they've been related to Cezanne's drawings of the Crouching Venus in the Louvre, which is a classical statue. Now, I don't have a photograph of the Crouching Venus from the same point of view as this detail from Cezanne, but I think you get the idea that these figures have been taken from art, and they have been stylized, simplified, and changed into more geometric forms. So when we look at this picture, we see the geometry or the pyramidal construction. You have these trees that form a kind of triangle or arc, or pointed arch maybe, but kind of a triangle format. And then when you look at the two groups of bathers down here, both on the left and the right, they collectively form kind of triangular forms. And then some of the individual figures are triangles in of themselves, the crouching figures in the foreground, for example. You'll also notice the planar recession into depth. So the figures are arrayed parallel to the picture plane in the front. And then there's another group just slightly behind the first row. And then there's the river. And then there's the land on the other side. And then there's trees and a building. And then you have the clouds parallel to the picture plane. So it's like a composition from Raphael or from Poussin that carries us back step by step into space. In fact, you could see this as a kind of abstract version of Renaissance geometric compositions. So here we have a Raphael to compare. And we have the pyramidal construction of the Madonna with the baby Jesus and the young Saint John the Baptist, and they're all unified with one pyramidal or triangular form. And then in the background, there are these parallel structures that are parallel to the picture plane, the trees and the mountains. And, the construction of it is very similar to what Cezanne is doing. So this is why Cezanne is sometimes called a classical post-impressionist. Sometimes the post-impressionists, who are all doing different things, are divided into sort of subgroups, and they talk about the ones who are interested in geometry and are more classical in the sense, and this would be Cezanne and Seurat. And then on the other side, they have the emotional, expressionistic post-impressionists such as Van Gogh and Gauguin. Now, let's talk about that idea of reconciling the dichotomies or harmonizing opposites. In this work, there are references both to nature, organic forms, living creatures, human beings, and geometry, because the living creatures, the human beings, are subject to being placed in geometric forms. There's that idea of surface and depth. We can look at this as a flat canvas with paint on it, which is what it really is, and we can look at the brushstrokes and see them all over the surface of the painting. Or we can take those clues of planar recession and see it as going back into space. And there's something else I noticed about this. Cezanne tries to harmonize complementary hues. Now, if you think back to the beginning of the class, we talked about complementary hues, colors that were the opposite on the color wheel, red and green, blue and orange, yellow and purple. And here we have blue and orange. Now, you might say, wait a minute, that's not orange. Actually, it is. It's orange that has been lightened and grayed down. So we might call them peachy colors in places, or russets. But essentially, they're orange. So what Cezanne has done is mix blues into oranges, oranges into blue, and that grays down the color a little bit. Remember, if we use equal amounts of complementary hues, we get gray. But if we use unequal amounts, it just makes the hues less saturated. It makes them slightly more gray, depending on how much you use of the complement. So he's got, as you can see, a number of blues here. Some are grayer than others. Same thing with these, as I said, peaches and russets, these orange tones. And then another thing he does is in the areas that are predominantly blue, he brings in some of those, peaches and russets that are in the ground and in the figures. And in the areas of the figures, he brings in the blues as shady. And that means that they're not fighting with each other as they would if they were fully saturated. He literally is trying to harmonize the opposite colors on the color wheel, which is very different than what this artist does. This artist is Vincent Van Gogh. Now, in the United States, we have a lot of trouble making that particular sound. I obviously do. And so we often just call him Vincent Van Gogh or Van Gogh. So the next post-impressionist artist we're going to talk about is the Dutch artist, Vincent van Gogh or Van Gogh. And here is a self-portrait. And as you can see, he's using a red-orange that's pretty saturated, a bright blue, and some other shades of blue, and many, many, many colors. So he's allowing his colors to be more saturated. Most of the artists we've been talking about recently are French. And, France seems to be the place where so many changes are happening in the art world. But Van Gogh is Dutch. He lives in the North Netherlands, and he had a very short artistic career, less than 1 decade. In fact, most of his works date from about a 6-year period, from 1885 to his death in 1890. His father is a Dutch Reform minister, and he thinks he would like to follow in his father's footsteps, but evidently he can't get into seminary. I guess he doesn't have the grades or something. And he's given an assignment as a missionary to go to the Belgian coal fields and preach to the miners. Now, Belgium's not very far away from the Netherlands, but these are people who are very oppressed. They go down into the mines before sunup. They come up after sundown. They're not paid well. There's not safety features at all. And even today how often and horrific it is, because we hear of mine tragedies with mines collapsing or gases igniting. So even more unsafe in the 19th century. And, these people were uneducated, and so Van Gogh's supposed to go and preach to them the gospel. He seems to have violated social mores. Presumably, the preacher is supposed to come and be, middle class and tell the coal miners that they must have faith and that as miserable as their lives are right now, they will be rewarded in heaven. But Vincent seemed to really empathize with these people. And he started trying to live the way they did. If they slept on straw, he'd sleep on straw. If they didn't have much to eat, he'd do the same thing. It didn't really work out as well as it sounds, because the coal miners, he wasn't one of them. So what is he doing? He's just too emotive for them, I guess. And then, of course, some observers from the missionary group show up, see what he's doing, and he is fired. And he turns to art. Now, his brother was an art dealer. His brother Theo was an art dealer. And we do have the letters that Theo kept from his brother Vincent. We don't have Theo's letters to Vincent because he didn't keep them, but we do have the letters that were written by Vincent van Gogh. And sometimes he does talk about his art in these. Just as I did with Cezanne, where I showed you an early work and then contrasted it with his mature work, what happened after he met the Impressionist, I'm going to do the same thing with Van Gogh. We're going to look at one of his early paintings and then see what happens after he sees Impressionist art. This is one of Van Gogh's very famous early paintings. It's called The Potato Eaters, and it dates from somewhere around 1885. Now, you can see stylistically he's using certain things like loose brush work. He's going to continue with that. Exaggeration and distortion. He'll continue with that. The work is very emotional. Yes, that's something that we see in other paintings by Van Gogh. But it's very dark. And that is something that will change. He uses tenebrism in this picture. You can see a dark world. All the edges are quite dark. And then in the center, there is a hanging oil lamp that sheds light on these people. The painting is based on his experience with the lives of the poor miners. And he writes to his brother Theo about this painting. And he says that he wants to make the painting the color of a very dusty potato, like the lives of the miners. What does he mean by that? Well, the miners in this picture have only potatoes for food. And he makes a kind of analogy between their lives. They're dirty. They're dug out of the ground. He's showing a great sympathy for the poor. And he shows the strong emotion, as we said, with color, in this case dark hues, and the contrast with the light. Distortion, if you look at some of these faces, particularly the figures on either side, they're extremely exaggerated. They almost seem animal-like, as though he's saying these people are treated like animals, or these people are treated like we should not treat animals or people. Sometimes in art you'll see distorted faces like that. I'm thinking of Peter Bruegel, actually. You didn't see this in this course, but Peter Bruegel does pictures of the tormentors of Christ. And Hieronymus Bosch does the same thing. He exaggerates their features and makes them look like evil people. And that's what's really interesting about Van Gogh's picture, because he's distorted the features, but he doesn't make them look evil. They still look dignified. There's such a sympathy with the poor and the downtrodden. And throughout his life, he expresses these strong emotions in his artwork with color, distortion, and loose brushwork. We actually have a name for this. When we have art that expresses strong, subjective emotion and the style leads you to it, and it's done with distortion, and then sometimes with bright colors, in this case it was dark colors, and visible brushstrokes, we call that Expressionism. And we'll talk more about that. Well, Van Gogh goes to Paris in 1886. He's going to go study art, and he's going to visit his brother Theo. And while he's in Paris, he sees the art of the Impressionists. Now, he's not working with them, but he sees their art, and it just changes his life. So what does he learn from Impressionism? He learns to lighten his palette. He learns to choose subjects from nature. Now, those are the same things that Cezanne learned. But Van Gogh does something totally different than Cezanne. He goes, you might say, to extremes. He goes further in the opposite direction, perhaps, from what he was doing before. Before, he's using these really dark colors. He sees the Impressionists and all this light, but he doesn't use Impressionist pastels. He uses bright colors and complementary hues or near complementary hues. For example, the two pictures we have here, you've seen the night cafe on the right before, and we talked about the bright green in the ceiling and the red on the walls and the kind of bilious green on the billiard table, and then, of course, it's great hot feeling with the golds and the reds predominating. We're going to look closely at Starry Night, which is the painting on the right, and it has near complements. It's blue with gold, but this essentially is a yellow-orange, so very near complements. Now, when you see this painting on a screen in a classroom, it's just blowing up. It looks huge and it looks like it can fill the space. What surprised me when I saw it was it's relatively small. The other thing that's really hard to tell from looking at a reproduction is the paint is in ridges. It's literally three-dimensional. If you would shine a raking light on the painting, the ridges of paint would cast shadows. It's that thick. And something else I want you to notice is he's not just painting with dabs of broken colors, that he's painting with these powerful brushstrokes that build up the I was one time, I've been teaching this course, I I've been teaching this painting in class years ago in an introductory class over and over and over again. And one day I just suddenly stopped and looked at the thing and I said, look at the structure of that. Because you see so many, actors playing Van Gogh and sort of putting on paint at random and furiously, and every stroke has a meaning. Every stroke just builds up the form of the picture, but it's extremely thick paint. So, unlike the Impressionists, Van Gogh's not interested in an objective interest in natural light. He's interested in emotion and a kind of emotional interpretation of nature that reflects the artist's emotion. So he's not an impressionist, he's an expressionist. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about what does expressionism mean. It's strong, subjective emotion, and in art you show this emotion by the style with distortion or exaggeration or abstraction. And, not all expressionist work has bright colors and loose brushwork, but much of it does. Now, expressionism is not just one art movement, although its name is used as a name for many art movements. But it is a stylistic tendency that we do see in different times in the history of art. So I'm going to show you a 14th century expressionist work. You've actually seen this before. I was comparing it to Michelangelo's Pietà, and where I was contrasting it with Michelangelo's Pietà. It's a 14th century German Vesperbild or Pietà, and you can see that the artist has enlarged the heads and made the figure very angular and has exaggerated elements of suffering. The globules of blood, are just huge. And although the paint has faded with time, it was originally, the paint would have had the blood dripping down the arms and the body of Christ, and probably would have been much brighter. So in this case, we have a medieval artist who's exaggerating shapes and probably once, the color was very bright, to emphasize the suffering of Christ. And yes, we can call this German Expressionism in the late Middle Ages. In fact, this is what I usually end my medieval course with. It's a kind of German Expressionism, which is the name that we give to a 20th century art movement. In the early 20th centuries, we talk about German Expressionism. In the middle of the 20th century, there's abstract expressionism, art that has no subject in the visible world. There's some of that in German Expressionism in the early years of the century as well. And then in the second half of the 20th century, there's another art movement that revives this kind of expressionism, and it's called neo-expressionism. So it's not just one art movement, but it certainly does describe what Van Gogh is doing. So I'm showing you Starry Night. And I also thought I'd like to bring in another work. This has a cypress in it. It has a landscape with the hills. It's almost like night and day here, except you're looking at the Wheatfield and Cypress from certainly a different angle. But you can see that he also works with very bright light colors as well as the night sky. The painting is painted for a strong emotional impact. As we said, he uses intense, nearly complementary hues, the gold or yellow, orange, and blue. There is an exaggeration or a distortion of shapes. Take that cypress tree. This is a European cypress, not a Florida cypress, and they generally are in a kind of conical, tapering shape. But this one seems to writhe and twist. And of course, the sky is just filled with energy and movement. The hills seem to be like waves or humpback whales migrating to the right side of the picture. I sometimes think of the cypress tree here, which is our repoussoir device, close to the picture plane, and then we look beyond it and we see the little village and the landscape. I sometimes say that cypress tree is a kind of giant thumbtack that holds the picture so that everything doesn't go off to the other side. And of course, it creates this asymmetrical composition. The sky is bursting with energy. There's a radiance around the stars and the moon. And then you have this great spiral, swirling shape. What is it? Is it a comet? What's going on here? And then the cypress. We mentioned the cypress. This has not just the browns, but it also has some very deep greens in it and really ridges of paint. And as you can see, it almost looks like a flame. It seems to writhe and twist. The cypress tree in Europe is often planted in cemeteries. And symbolically, it's often associated with death. You may know from Shakespeare, one of the songs, it says, "In a sad cypress, let me be laid." And then Agatha Christie picks up that and uses Sad Cypress as the title of one of her murder mysteries. Now, the association with death goes back much further than that. And that's why they were using the cypress as a kind of death emblem in those literary works. People look at this and they try to figure out, what does it mean? And there have been, different interpretations. Some people, point out the death imagery of the cypress, and they say that, well, this was painted the year before Van Gogh died, so it's foreshadowing his death. Well, it might mean that to someone today, but I don't think that Vincent Van Gogh knew that he was going to die the next year. So I don't think that's really what he's painting. Meyer Shapiro, who is a medieval art historian, he studies medieval art, and he also studies late 19th and early 20th century art. And he related this to the apocalypse. The end of the world. The stars seem to be falling from the sky, or the heavens are, ablaze. It does have that feeling. Is that, though, what Van Gogh is saying? We certainly have a little reference here to spirituality, if you will, the little village church with the vertical steeple, which parallels the large vertical of the cypress, sort of, death and spirituality, perhaps. Or, I look at this and I just see so much energy in it. Is it a kind of affirmation of life in the face of death? Well, I can't ask you on an exam, what does this mean? Because we don't really know. And one of the things we're seeing with these late 19th century and artists, and then the artists going into the 20th and 21st centuries, is that their iconography can be personal iconography. It can mean something to them. And they can be trying to be quite original with it. Sometimes, like with the potato eaters, Van Gogh tells his brother something about what he means by it. But other times, we look at this and we draw our own meanings from it. And different people have different reactions to it. We don't have Cesare Ripa's iconologia that we can open up and say, okay, this means this. Or a convention such as the Holy Spirit referring to, or a convention such as the dove of the Holy Spirit. It's a personal iconography that's being created. Now, one of the things that I'm sure you've heard about Vincent van Gogh was that he was a crazy artist. He's sometimes portrayed that way in movies, for example. I suppose it depends on what you mean by crazy, but what it was he was epileptic. He had seizures. And he would have seizures in which he would black out. He wouldn't remember what he had done, but he would do something and then hear about it from other people later. It terrified him. The most famous episode, and probably the worst one, was what I'm calling the ear episode. And here you see a couple of his self-portraits with the bandaged ear. The artist Paul Gauguin came down to visit him. And, Van Gogh was really happy. This great artist is coming down, and I'm sure he thought they were going to be buds. As it was, Gauguin was not the nicest person in the world. He deserts his wife and children. He goes off to Tahiti. And he didn't really get along with Van Gogh very well. They fought. And after one argument, Vincent has a seizure. And when he wakes up, he finds that he has cut off part of his ear, I think the earlobe, fleshy part of the ear. And this is weird, I know. He put it in a box and sent it to a prostitute that they both know. I don't know, were they arguing about the prostitute? I keep thinking about that poor woman opening the box and finding this bit of flesh inside. It bothered him. They always say you're not really crazy if you think you are. And he did seek treatment. He went to an asylum. He wasn't locked up. He was there on his own volition, trying to get whatever medical care was available in the 19th century. He could go out during the day and paint. And one day he went out and somehow found a gun and shot himself. At least that's what's usually said. He thought he was a failure. I've read he sold only one work. His brother found a buyer. And then Vincent says, oh no, I'm not good enough. It's not ready yet. So I'm not sure if that fell through or not, because I saw another place where it said he never sold anything in his lifetime. I think he thought he was a burden to his brother. His brother was supporting him. I recently read another interpretation of this on the internet, in which someone has suggested that he didn't commit suicide, that it was essentially manslaughter, that there were some boys, young men it sounded like, but who would torment Van Gogh and tease him. And one day they got a gun, and whether, what exactly happened, nobody knows, but shot him. And that rather than have the boys go to prison or be hung, he said he did it himself before he died. I don't know what the truth of that is. I don't know. At any rate, he died before he was well known. But I think if he had lived his normal lifespan, he would have probably become known as this grand old man of painting, the way Cezanne was. Cezanne, it took a long time before he became, well known in artistic circles. And when he was an older man, young men would go to him and young artists and say, well, how did you do it? The same thing might have happened to Van Gogh. 5 years later, 1895, the art dealer Vollard, who is the dealer who helped so many of the late 19th and early 20th century artists get known, Vollard had a show for Van Gogh. And, as you know, today, Van Gogh is one of the most beloved artists of all time. Yes, he gets his paintings sell for millions of dollars. I always suspect that Van Gogh would be very surprised about that, but I think he'd be very, very happy to know that his paintings were beloved today. And it's a very sad story. How did he get the reputation of a crazy rather than a tragic artist? In the 20th century, when psycho and analytical methods became, sort of very famous, there was a person who wrote an article claiming that Van Gogh was schizophrenic. As it turns out, that has been disproven over and over again. His artwork is almost the opposite of what schizophrenics create. Their work disintegrates as it is, as their disease progresses, and his is so structured. And also, he doesn't have the symptoms of schizophrenia. He was epileptic. I suppose it's possible it could have been a brain tumor, but he had seizures. He was epileptic and not schizophrenic. Now, one of the things you've noticed as we looked at Cezanne's work and at Van Gogh's work was that both of them use distortion and exaggeration, sometimes for compositional reasons or conceptual reasons, and sometimes, in the case of Van Gogh, for emotional impact. And this is, I guess you could say, the reintroduction of abstraction in art. There was abstraction, of course, in the Middle Ages. But since the Renaissance, most professional artists were trying to create art that created the illusion of nature. And now we're seeing artists going in another way, exaggerating, distorting, creating abstraction. And the post-impressionist abstraction is a very important influence on modernism of the 20th century. It's very influential on the beginnings of modernism in the 20th century. For example, Cezanne influenced Cubism. Van Gogh and Gauguin influenced expressionistic movements such as Fauvism, which we'll hear about next.